Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to be discussing my research focus on vacant land as bee habitat with you tonight. Maybe if I can get my slide to advance. Okay. So for those that don't know me, I just wanted to give a couple of slides in background since we don't meet in person, just about what I do. So I'm a professor in the entomology department at Ohio State. And 85% of my job is doing research, which means I run a lab of graduate students and postdocs, and we study important questions related to insect conservation in cities in our program. We're interested in the ecology of urban green spaces, especially vacant lots, and we're interested in how we might design and manage them to promote them as habitat for insects like pollinators. We're also interested in things like how their landscape context might influence their value for bees, as well as the legacy of the city if it had sources of pollution in the past, if those contaminants remain, and what threats they might play for pollinator conservation. And so here's a picture of my current lab. So all of these women are graduate students working on their master's or PhD degree, studying beneficial insects, or also Lydia studies mosquito pests in cities. In addition to doing research, I also do programs like this through my extension appointment. Quite a bit of what I do is master gardener programming. I've done some community science programs like this Buckeye Lady Beetle Blitz survey and our Dandelion Detectives program in the past. I also have done some 4-H curriculum development. If you have youth that you have in your family or know some kids that are really into bugs, we have a relatively new, I think this was published in 2018, new curriculum, 4-H curriculum about insects. You can check that out on the 4-H website. And I also teach courses. I teach a grant writing class, I teach an insect ecology class and a presentation class. And one of the next things I'll be doing in terms of remote learning for the public are classes in presentation skills, which we're hoping to launch next year. So I can make sure to get that to Andrew so he can circulate that information if you're interested. But tonight we're going to talk about insects in cities, which is an important issue. So urbanization, when we think about the building of urban areas, that typically leads to a decline in many kinds of plants and animals. And this happens for many reasons, but one of the key reasons is habitat fragmentation. When you put up buildings and make new roads, it cuts pieces of green space into smaller and smaller fragments, and that reduces the types of animals that are able to exist in what's left. So when we build urban areas, we predict that there'll be fewer species, more exotic species that can tolerate these challenging conditions, and more generalist species that can feed on a large number of different sources. But bees don't always get the message when it comes to these predictions. And if you look through the literature where people have studied bees in cities, there are many cases where when you go to rural areas, there are more bee species there. And as you move into cities, there are fewer. But there are also many people who have found that urban areas have just as many or even more species of bees than surrounding rural places. So why does this vary? Why are cities different from one another? Well, just like any habitat, like a wetland or forest, cities are unique ecosystems. They vary in habitat quality for bees. There are many biological, social, economic, and political drivers that make up how a city is structured and how it functions. And those drivers influence everything, including the quality of bee habitat. And this is important in Ohio because I bet some of you would be surprised to learn just how many bees we have in Ohio. We have about 500 bee species, or 450 to 500 bee species, depending on the reference. And we have found in Cleveland alone, over 20% of these species. So over 100 species of bees, if you live in Northeast Ohio, can be found in residential and vacant green spaces within the city. So habitats that look just like these in my pictures, which I think is just really cool and astonishing. So when we think about all this bee diversity, we want to know what are the factors, what are the variables within a city that influence the quality of that city for all these bees. And of course, as I said, there are many kinds of cities. I focused so far much of my research on what are called legacy cities or shrinking cities. And these are cities where, sorry, I'm going to hide those meeting controls because I can't see my slides. These are cities that have lost a substantial proportion of their population. So across the world, there are 450 cities that have had significant population decline. And one of these is Cleveland. And many of the other cities that that are shrinking cities are shown in red and orange areas here on this map. So you can see there are quite a few shrinking cities in the state of Ohio, but also in surrounding states as well. Cleveland, Ohio, here in Northeast Ohio, for those are from outside the state, it was once the 5th largest city, but it has lost more than 50% of its peak population. Many of the people who have left Cleveland, they've left for a number of different reasons. However, the houses that are left in many of the neighborhoods surrounding the downtown area do not have a lot of real estate value to be resold. Unfortunately, people are foreclosed on, and in some cases, the houses are condemned. These are relatively poor areas where sometimes in some neighborhoods, the poverty rate is almost 40%. And so it's very sad that people are losing their houses. And then unfortunately, those houses are being torn down. And this has been going on for several decades now. And what you see when you drive around the neighborhoods of Cleveland is a lot of vacant lots. And so the city of Cleveland is outlined here in gray and shaded in gray. All of its existing parkland, like the metro parks and city parks, are green. And all of the red areas are vacant parcels. So Cleveland has over 30,000 vacant parcels. And you can really start to see how they're individual lots if you look at this map up here. And so this is a major shift in the distribution of green space. We used to have just the parks. Now we have all of this other vacant green space too. So what does this look like on the ground? So here are some pictures that I've taken in neighborhoods where we've worked of houses that are foreclosed, boarded up, and awaiting a tear down from the city. And this is what the tear down looks like. And then after they remove that construction material, what is left is a vacant lot. A vacant lot is seeded with fescue grass by the city, but it is mown once a month. And what grows when you mow these lots once a month is a mix of early successional weedy vegetation that flowers. And so while some people might look at this and say, what a pile of weeds, if you think about it as habitat, there's a lot of habitat potential here for something that feeds on flowers, right? And so we were wondering, are these vacant lots valuable bee habitat? And can we manage them in ways that support bee dispersal, foraging, and nesting, while also meeting the needs of the community that live near the vacant lots? People have certain aesthetic expectations. They care about their safety. They have values that they want to see in their green infrastructure. And we need to seek balance here when we're designing habitat. So that was our main question. And I've been working on this for a long time. I've been at Ohio State since 2009. And for 7 years, I ran the Cleveland Pocket Prairie Project, which examined that major question that I just went over. Can vacant land provide bee habitat? With funding from the National Science Foundation, we set up a citywide field experiment. And within this experiment, we had 4 vacant lot treatments. And then we had 8 lots that made up each treatment for a total of 40 lots that I managed for each of the 7 years. The treatments were a control lot. And in that lot, set of 8 lots, we left the vegetation as the city had it, and we kept mowing it once a month, just like they did. So that was our control. Then we also had a meadow habitat. When you talk to people that are super pro bee, one of the things they really like to do is let everything grow throughout the season. And so we wanted to investigate, well, does doing that really help bees? Then, of course, there are many recommended products and seed mixes for pollinators, and we evaluated 2. One was a flowering lawn. This was a low-growing turf with exotic low-growing flowers. And then we also had a pocket prairie, which was the namesake for the project. And this was a tall grass planting with native wildflowers that were known to be attractive to bees. So I wanted to show you what the treatments look like. So this is the control lot that was mown once a month. And this is the meadow mown annually. You can see it got really tall. There's some milkweed in there and some grass. This is the flowering lawn. You can see it's pretty short and it has a nice flush of low growing flowers. And then this is the pocket prairie. You can see in the back some signs, like that's one of those no parking signs. So that's probably at like 6 feet. This is tall, this vegetation. And you can see it's very dense with also lots of flowers. So how did we set up these sites? A lot of people might want to make one of these sites. And so I like to give a little bit more detailed background on how we established the pocket prairie and the flowering lawn. So we did this in partnership with Ohio Prairie Nursery, which in our region is an excellent native plant producer and company that installs these kinds of sites. To prepare the sites, we applied herbicide 3 times during the spring and summer of 2014. And I know someone's going to ask me, why did you apply herbicide? Well, we had a total of 16 urban lots that we were going to plant either with the flowering lawn or the prairie. And we did not have a timeline or the manpower or facilities to tarp 16 full-size lawns to solarize them, which would have been another option if you were doing a small planting or maybe a single site. And the weed seed pressure was extremely high, and Ohio Prairie Nursery suggested this strategy. It was important to us as researchers to make sure these plantings were well established so we could really measure their effectiveness. So after the herbicide treatments, we tilled the sites lightly and so that we could incorporate compost and micronutrients. And that was in the fall of 2014. And then we broadcast seeded in the fall. The flowering lawn was mown monthly. It was supposed to be a no mow, but we found when we didn't mow, it became taken over by weedy vegetation. So we mowed that monthly for the entire 7-year project. The pocket prairie was mown monthly the first year to cut back some of the weed pressure and allow the plants to take hold. But then after that, it was just cut annually in the fall. So what did it look like in the pocket prairie? So on the 2014 picture here, this is what it looked like right in the spring after we'd seeded. This is like very early spring. And I was really panicking because nothing was coming up. And it took 3 years for the plants to flower. So if you're putting in a pocket prairie with a community group, it's extremely important that you manage their expectations for what it's going to look like, because it's going to look like a weedy mess for the first 2 summers until those plants start to flower. So what did flower? So in our flowering lawn, it was called the Florida Lawn Seed Mix. These are all the plants that we planted, perennial ryegrass, fescues, and all of these flowers. We did document all of the flowers coming up and blooming within our sites, but within a couple years, the site became heavily clover dominated. So it went from looking like these pictures on the top to this here. And so it kind of made me wonder for the cost, if this really was worth the diversity, since it didn't maintain very long term, that I might just do a clover fescue grass blend if I was looking to provide low growing pollinator habitat, since the bees really do love visiting clover. In the pocket prairie, we also had a subset of our plants established. So here in this big box are all of the plants that we planted. Here in the smaller box are all of the things that came up, and the bold ones are ones that we saw in all 8 of the sites. So these are real true urban stars when it comes to wildflowers. So things like gray-headed coneflower, foxglove beer tongue, cup plant, New England aster, wild bergamot, they're excellent plants to consider when planting in soils like this. The other thing to remember is that it wasn't a clean planting just of these plants. There was a seed bank. And so we also had a lot of weeds. So here are some pictures of the different plants that did really well. These prairies were really beautiful and provided a lot of great habitat. Here's what they look like all together. And you can see that mixed in quite happily with my native plants is chicory and Queen Anne's lace, which are also flowers that bees visit, but they might not be flowers that people want to see. So again, something to consider You're not going to be able to come in here and pull the chicory. I mean, look at how it's woven through. That would be a total nightmare. Okay, so we had all these sites, all these plantings. How do we know if they're valuable for bees? We put out pan traps, which mimic flowers, and the pollinators become trapped in the soapy water. We then pin and identify all of the species that are there. And we also did floral observations, where we take these vacuums and we collect for 5 minutes off each blooming plant. And from this, we were able to answer a bunch of important conservation questions that we had. So the first most basic one was, well, does mowing frequency affect bee species richness? Are there more bee species if you mow less? This is a question I get asked all the time from the public. And it's very interesting, actually, what we found. So we predicted that the meadow treatment would have more bee diversity than the control lot, because the meadow was only mown once a year and the control was mown monthly. But actually, we found the opposite. The monthly mowing maintained the weedy flower abundance, whereas the meadow became very grass dominated. So there's more resources actually here for bees. And so the meadow treatment was not great for pollinators, which was actually a good thing, because people uniformly did not like the meadow treatment, to the extent that I removed it after the second year from the study, because I got so many calls telling me that they were going to call the city on me, that people just hated it. And so, is a pollinator habitat effective when everyone hates it? Absolutely not. So this was a lose situation. However, we were very excited that the control lot, which is managed, following the city guidelines, was really a great bee habitat. So meadow, no. So of course, when I tell people this, they say, well, okay, so if mowing's good, can I mow like really frequently and herbicide the lawn? And well, no. I mean, eventually you're going to remove the habitat of the lawn. So mowing weekly is going to be too frequent in a vacant lot to promote flowering of many of these species. So there is kind of this happy medium or lazy lawnmower approach. So this is not going to be good. But our conservation takeaway is that this lazy lawnmower approach of mowing monthly to vacant land promotes blooms and bees. So our next question was, okay, that's good. The control lot is a good bee habitat, but what about all of these recommended flowering lawns and pocket prairies that folks are planting for bees? Do those enhance the number of bee species that you find able to live in Cleveland? So we compared all of these species, all of these sites. And in this case, we found that all 3 of these were good bee habitats. We did not find a significant difference in the number of bee species in each of these habitats. They all were good bee habitats. And what actually mattered the most was the number of flowers they had. So regardless of the treatment, if a pocket prairie or a control lot had more flowers than a pocket prairie or a control lot that had fewer flowers, there were more bees. So bees were not picky about the types of flowers that they were able to access. It was sheer numbers that mattered. So as you had more blooms, you had more bees. So our takeaway here is that it's the number of flowers and not necessarily the type that matter most for these urban bees. So weeds, like in the control lot, flowering non-native plants or native plants were all attractive. So our next question wanted to dig a little deeper. Sure, we see a lot of bees in each of these habitats, but how are they doing? What is their health like? Well, to find out that, you have to do a little bit more of an in-depth study than simply collecting them. So we decided to focus on reproduction. We wanted to know if seeding with the flowering habitats improved their reproduction. And to do this, we focused on bees that nest in cavities. Many of you may have a bee house with cavity nests for cavity nesting bees, where there's holes and they go inside and make a nest. Researchers use these to assess bee reproductive success in habitats, and we call them trap nests. So we put these trap nests out in each habitat that had various sized holes in them, and the bees colonize them, and then we X-ray them and we determine the number of larvae that are inside. And we use this to know the reproductive success of each female, because each female uses its own straw to make a nest. So this particular female had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 offspring. So we would count up the offspring and look at the total number and also the richness or numbers of species that are able to nest in these sites. So what did we find here? Well, interestingly, we actually did see that the reproductive success of bees increased in the native plant treatment. So here we have the native larvae count from those x-rays in the control, the flowering lawn, and the pocket prairie. And you can see that from the control, the flowering lawn was a bit higher and the flowering prairie was even a bit higher yet. The only significant difference from a statistics standpoint was the flowering prairie was higher than the control. But there was no significant difference between the flowering lawn and the prairie or the flowering lawn and the control. It was like intermediate. So this tells you that planting native plants is important for improving the reproductive success of cavity nesting solitary bees. So all of these habitats are important for providing forage, but in particular, this pocket prairie seems to be very important for promoting health. The next thing we wanted to know is, okay, so we need to plant pocket prairies and we need to manage vacant lots for bees, but does it matter where we do this? There's 30,000 vacant lots in Cleveland. How do we choose where to put a conservation habitat? And in some neighborhoods, there might be just one vacant lot with houses around it, whereas in other neighborhoods, there could be blocks that are completely vacant. Like you can see in this picture, all of these things are driveways. So there's 4 or 5 driveways and a giant patch. Does this matter? So in order to test this, we looked at the landscape surrounding each one of our vacant lots. So remember, we had those 40 lots, the 4 treatments. While we worked with the city of Cleveland and their planning commission was nice enough to provide us with really great land cover data. And the land cover data told you in great detail at a 1 kilometer or a 1 meter resolution whether the site was surrounded by green space in green, buildings in red, impervious surface or pavement in gray, or bare ground or grass in yellow. And we calculated the amount of green habitat, which was trees and shrubs and grasses surrounding each vacant lot. And some of our sites had really well-connected green habitat like this one. So you can see here's our vacant lot in the center. And you can see a lot of the green habitat, like this large area along Martin Luther King Drive, is very highly connected. Whereas in other sites, the vacant lot was surrounded mostly by impervious surface, which you can see here. This poor vacant lot has very little green space around it. And so we predicted that habitats that looked very connected, that there would be more bee species because the bee species could fly into the lot from all these other patches. Whereas here, they're not going to come from a parking lot. And if they are in the lot, they don't have a lot of other places to forage. So it's really a tough environment, this lot. So what did we find? Well, we found support for our prediction, our hypothesis. We found more species of bees in these connected lots and also more smaller bee species. And that makes sense because if you're a smaller bee, you might really be challenged by flying over buildings or roads. You probably can't go that far to find resources. So this kind of connected habitat is really good. We also found better reproductive success in these connected landscapes, which is also important. We need our bees to be able to be healthy and reproduce. So our takeaway here is if you're going to be installing a habitat and putting effort into maintaining it, target a place with high vacancy or nearby parks or large green spaces. So finally, as I was out there every day for many years, collecting data, mowing, trimming, doing all the maintenance on the site, I would think about the history of Cleveland and where we came from and why we had these vacant lots and all of the things that happened, right, to get us to this place. You can't help but think through how industries have changed when you're in a landscape with so much vacancy. And so if we think back in history of Cleveland, it was an industrial center. It was a leader in iron and steel production for a good while, right? But then, unfortunately, as those industries changed, we now have a mostly post-industrial city. But what remains from a lot of that industrial past is heavy metal contamination. Heavy metals are things like lead, cadmium, and chromium that occur naturally in our soil, but from contamination can occur at really high or elevated levels. So the challenge was, are bees encountering this heavy metal? And so one of the first things I did was I worked with a group of residents in Cleveland and surrounding counties. Some of you might even been one of these households. We put out bumblebees in people's backyards and we just asked the question, do bees pick up heavy metals? And unfortunately, what we found was the bees that were foraging within the city of Cleveland had higher heavy metals in the pollen and nectar that they collected than bees that foraged in the suburbs like Shaker Heights and Brunswick. We had sites, or in rural places. We had sites all the way down to Worcester. So the big question is, well, does this matter? You know, if you test them and they have heavy metal contamination, is there a consequence for their health? So my student did a research project where we took the concentrations that we found in the Cleveland nectar and pollen that those bees collected, and we put bees in flight tents, colonies of bumblebees, and we fed them solutions of sugar water that we made where we added the concentrations of the heavy metals that we found in Cleveland bees. And they were really, really minuscule amounts of heavy metal that we were adding. And when we were doing it, we thought there's no way this is going to have an impact. And I could tell my student that I might be a little bit insane, but I said, no, we've got to do the exact concentration we had in the field. If we don't see an effect, we'll look at higher concentrations, more like you find in a Superfund site. So she put these bumblebees in these tents and let them forage for 15 days from these solutions. And this is what we found. So some of the bees just got sugar water, and that's the blue control. And then she also had tents where the bees got one of the heavy metal concentrations we found in the Cleveland hives. But the thing about these heavy metals is when you have high concentrations of one, you often find high concentrations of other metals because they're all coming from similar sources. And so it was more common in the hives to have all the heavy metals be elevated or not. So we also had a tent that received a elevated of all the heavy metals. And what she found was for each of these four metals, so arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and lead, when they had the Cleveland concentration, we had 3 to 4 times the mortality of the bee larvae than we did in the controlled hives. When they got all the heavy metals, we had 9 times the mortality. And that's significant if you're thinking about bee concentration. And just to show a difference, here's the healthy larva and then the dead larva. So our conservation takeaway is here, it's important to soil test and avoid heavy metal contaminated sites. And not only would I test your plot, but if you have access to other vacant lots near your plot, it would be a good idea to test those. We have some resources at Ohio State to provide soil testing, so this would not be an expensive undertaking. It's really important. So with all this in mind, how can we approach bee conservation so that we help bees and provide beautiful habitats that people also enjoy? When we think about tall vegetation, this is not something that everyone is going to like. And I have fielded many calls where I have a bee person who is obsessed with having very tall bee habitat and their neighbor who absolutely cannot stand their bee habitat. And unfortunately, that is going to turn that person off even more to bee conservation. And you're not going to win out once you're in an argument with somebody. And I strongly, propose that this is not a good way to go about it. So every spring, for instance, it's when it rains a lot, it's hard for the city to get out and mow grass. And there's always news stories about how people are irritated if that's not happening. So tall vegetation is not going to be acceptable. Also, people might not think that creating habitat for bees or other wildlife is a good idea. People might be afraid of bees or have a bee allergy. So it's important to talk to people about what you're doing before you get going. And you want to co-create with the community, the city, and researchers when you're doing something like this so that everybody can contribute to the design, figure out where to put it, and consider threats like pollution when we're making these decisions. So one of the theories that we incorporated with minimal success due to budget in our sites was Joan Nassauer's cues to care theory. Joan has written many amazing research papers focused on what people value in green habitat. And things that appear purposeful, such as clean edges, beautiful, colorful flowers, overlapping green leafy plants that differ in their sort of their texture. These are all elements that we know that most people like. They also like things like fencing and signage and clean sites and frequent mulching. And this is really hard to take and then put into practice when you're managing vacant lots for a number of reasons. One was budget, also getting, all of the things watered when you don't have access to irrigation, et cetera. And so this is what we came up with, which I, really do not think is sufficient, but we had this small fence, we mulched the front, we mowed a border around the lot, and we put up signs. So what were some of the challenges that we faced with our little fencing and things? Well, first of all, people did not necessarily like the aesthetics. And the biggest complaint we got was the presence of weeds. When people see a habitat that's been established for a purpose, they don't want to see weeds in it. And so that was a problem when the plants were in bloom and people could identify the weeds. It was also a problem early in the season before flowering because people would think that this was just tall weeds and want me to cut it down. And so education and incorporating community feedback early so that people understand what you're doing, why you're doing, and what it's going to look like is really critical. Because some people like very tended flowers, even to the point that there are many gardens surrounding our lots that had fake silk flowers. People love neat and tidy gardens, right? And so when you're putting in this is not like this. It's not neat and tidy. So that's a big step for somebody to take. In addition to our aesthetics, they were further challenged by vandalism and dumping. So if you're going to manage a habitat like this, you have to have a large group on the ground that can frequently go out and remove broken sampling equipment, fix signs that have been destroyed, and remove debris. We removed a ton of tires, bags and bags of trash, mattresses, couches, construction debris, all sorts of stuff. I would rent a dump truck every year because in the winter, construction companies would come into the city and dump debris and all sorts of stuff in our sites. So this would have been a disaster without the budget we had, and also something you really need to think about if you're going to do something like this. The other real challenge I had was finding good help is hard. So we wanted to hire a contractor to keep up some of our cues to care, such as the mowing. I had a small group of grad students at the time, and I thought, well, we can hire somebody to mow the borders. That shouldn't be that challenging, but it ended up being very challenging. They would not mow the tree lawn, or they would mow a crooked border like this. That's not a good look for a site. Or in this case, they mowed through the lot in the late summer, creating a strip. They wouldn't brush off the sidewalk. We had all kinds of problems. And so I ended up buying my own equipment to maintain the sites. And that really helped us respond to community challenges quick. So if somebody called me and said, hey, it rained last night really hard, and, there's some debris from your mulch that's washed onto the sidewalk, and the sites, the grass could be mowed. We could be up there the next morning to cut it. The other big challenge that you have when you're placing sites is you have to be aware of fears that people might have when you install tall vegetation. And this is a story about a site that was on Community College Drive, which is a pretty busy road. Here, the site is right on the corner, and there's a bus stop on one side. So we got this email from a citizen that she was afraid to walk to the bus in the morning because with the height of the plants, she was afraid of getting robbed or worse by someone hiding in here. And this really struck me because the previous week before I got this email, I was out with my grad student, Janisha, who's here. She's about 5'7". And we did a field day for kids in that same site. Here's that same gas station. And the kids had a ton of fun, and it was such a positive experience. But I wasn't out walking early in the morning to the bus, and I wasn't thinking about, how someone might feel trying to do that. And so when you're thinking about where to put sites, you don't really want tall vegetation where someone might be trying to wait for a bus, or something where they could have a perceived or real threat of this taller vegetation. This was a neighborhood where, unfortunately, right around the corner, we saw this monument to a young man who had been killed. So, this woman's fears were very legitimate. And even if they weren't, even if she lived in a neighborhood where there had not been any kind of violent crime for decades, if someone's afraid, your conservation planting has failed, in my opinion. It needs to be something that is accepted and seen as a shining star or benefit for the community. So what do we do if we're interested in doing something like this? I've written a lot about this in papers, and so if people want more information, you can ask me for those. But from a basic standpoint, everyone's opinion matters. There are many ways to support bee health. For instance, I talked about the vacant lots being very valuable. You don't need a pocket prairie everywhere to support bees. So seek win-win scenarios that also aid human well-being and engage neighbors in participating. Build a team right from the get-go. It should include all of these people: city and community leaders, the neighbors, land use planners, and conservation folks. Don't establish a site and then beg people to forgive you and accept it. And consider a long-term plan and budget. So you need to respond to complaints in a timely manner, or your efforts will be short-lived. Many people establish these plantings using a grant. When that grant ends, what is the long-term funding plan? So that's a little highlight of all of the things I worked on as part of my Cleveland Pocket Prairie project. I want to thank you for your attention this evening. I want to acknowledge all of the residents that we worked with on our project and our summer undergrads who worked so hard, along with my grad students, all of our partners and our funding. And I would be happy to take any questions. I've also put my email here. If you email me, sometimes I've gotten over hundreds of emails when I give these programs. If you email me and I don't respond within a few days, please resend your email, but I'll leave that up for a second. I think you're muted, Andrew.
There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you for sharing all your research with us. And that was very, very informative, and looks like people are showing their appreciation in the chat box. We can't clap, so let Dr. Gardiner know what you think in the chat box. A lot of people are saying that's excellent. In the Q&A box, I'll pull that up here. We do have some questions. Maybe, let's see. If you want, are you able to see the Q&A box too?
Oh yeah, I can open it. Sorry.
There's a lot of good questions in there, but I'll let you pick out some because that would probably be.
Okay, well, let's start with this first one. So bee hotels, good or disease spreaders? Bee hotels can be good for educational purposes because people really see the types of tiny bees that are living in their landscape. I haven't read too much about bee hotels really making a big difference for conservation, but if you manage bee hotels right, they should not be big disease spreaders. So it is important to clean bee hotels and make sure that you don't use them year after year. So what a lot of groups, conservation orgs suggest you do is take down the bee hotel in early spring and put it in a container in the shade where the bees can get out of it, and then put up fresh new bee hotels for that season. And then once the bees have emerged from your current hotel, put it in a bleach solution, like a 10 or 20% bleach solution, to kill off any diseases. So that is an important thing. Many bees are specialists. Does plant diversification versus number of flowers make a difference? Absolutely. So the bees that we see in Cleveland are very heavily dominated by generalists, as I mentioned at the beginning. And there are a few specialists that we do find in the city, but many of them we don't see. And actually, it's funny that you asked that, because this summer I'm working with Denise Ellsworth, who I think has already spoken to this group possibly, but her and I have come up with, and also Deb Napke is going to be one of your speakers at the live program, a specialist bee garden, and we will be distributing these in Ohio. We also have a garden by number card that's going to be coming out to show you how to make a specialist bee garden. And so that will be something new that we will be studying to see if we plant certain plants, if we can attract those specialists in the city. Are there plants that will take out heavy metals from soils? There are plants that phytoremediate soil, but it would be easier to have a soil amendment that you could put when you're taking down the building that would reduce the bioavailability of the lead. And so we've been going that route. We've been working with Kurtz Brothers, a great Northeast Ohio company, to develop some soil blends that a colleague of mine, Dr. Nick Basta, has been testing to see if they reduce the movement of heavy metals into plants. And we've been actually growing some weeds in the greenhouse with these blends to see which ones work best. And we'll be testing these out in Slavic Village. And actually, we're going to be having a field day there this summer for the public. Let's see. Can you talk a little bit more about this idea of weeds? Because my understanding is there is a large spectrum of what people consider a weed. So a weed is just a plant growing where someone doesn't want it. When I talk about weeds, I'm talking about early successional vegetation. So those are plants that come up very early after disturbance. And in our sites, the majority of those are non-native European species like Queen Anne's lace, dandelions. Well, dandelions are actually from all over, but Queen Anne's lace, chicory, white clover, red clover, things like this. And so those are really valuable, but most people will see those as plants they don't really want, although that's really changing, I feel. When the lots are sold, do new owners' buildings use the seed bank from the seed mix in future? So these lots are not sold. I should have said that. So we leased these lots from the Cleveland Land Bank, and the land bank is the one that mows these sites.
There was one question in there that I think I could answer. The other ones I can't, but someone asked about procedure for having a soil test done. And we sell soil test kits at our extension office here in Ashtabula. If you're not in Ashtabula County, your local extension office has that available. The ones that we have, they're $15, but if you want to test for heavy metals, it's an additional cost to that. But we have them available. You can also get them available at a couple other places. A lot of agricultural cooperatives have them available as well. But yeah, call your local extension office and they'll be able to point you in the right direction if they don't have them available.
There's so many questions. Andrew, do you see another one that?
Yeah, let me look through. We're getting close to 8 o'clock. And again, we appreciate everybody asking questions. We'll try to answer maybe one or two more, and then we'll end tonight's program. But let's see. So someone's asking, is there any place where they should report the bee species that we see in our yard, something along the lines of iNaturalist, but specific to bee research data? And maybe you have something in there as well, but I would say that's a pretty good plug for our NETS presentation in 2 weeks. Here.
I think that's the perfect lead into next week's or 2 weeks from now's presentation.
Yeah.
Because I know there's many different bee monitoring sites, and I'm sure they'll go over some of the options there. Somebody asked, what other research is our lab undertaking? So this summer we will be, I mentioned that specialist bee project. We will also be doing quite a bit of work here in Columbus with the Community Backyards program. If you live in Columbus, Ohio, or Franklin County, You might be familiar with the Franklin County Soil and Water District Community Backyards Program, where you can get a rebate to plant native plants in your backyard. So we're going to be looking at a number of different factors related to these installments. There's been over 3,000 installments across Columbus. And we're going to be asking questions like, does it matter how clustered these habitats are? Does it matter how old they are? Does it matter what the landscape context looks like? Are there really more bees in these community backyards versus people's yards that did not participate in community backyards? And so if you did participate in community backyards, shoot me an email, because my grad students are, you should have gotten an email from my grad sites. So that's one of my main research projects right now, but most of the stuff I do is within cities. I can't really go into the what are your suggestions for team building in neighborhoods. That's a whole presentation. But Sue, if you want to send me an email, I can send you some of my papers, but I am a biologist. And so these are just things I've learned from working with social scientists. And I would highly suggest be fun to bring in a social scientist to a bee program like this in the future, maybe to talk about that. Can you describe the bee collection traps? Why are there 3 bowl colors? The bowl colors are reflective paints that have been found to be highly attractive to different bees, and certain bees are really attracted to the 3 different colors. So we use the different colors because they attract different species of bees, and so you get a good sample by doing that.
All right.
Oh, here's a really practical one. I'll finish with this one. What
Okay.
kind of mower do you use to cut the lawn monthly? I bought a mulching, very expensive mulching lawn mower, and it had a deck that could be raised up to about 6.5 inches. And so we were able to mow the borders with that, but to cut the big lawn, like the whole lawn monthly, we also relied on the city at times coming in with their big equipment. They have like a pull behind mower. And so I have cut them with my mulching mower, but it is a process. Not something you'd want to do multiple sites. You would need a pull behind mulching tractor mower.
All right. Well, right at 8 o'clock, right in the dot, we will be sending out emails to everybody. If you're still on, we'll be sending out emails for our presentation in 2 weeks. So watch out for that. Get on your calendar, 7 o'clock, 2 weeks from now, which is the 9th. And we're very excited for our last one, but let's thank Dr. Gardiner again for her excellent presentation. If you haven't already. I see a lot of people saying thanks again in the chat.
Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. I appreciate everyone being here. And thanks, Andrew, for having me.